What's up guys? Welcome to my channel. My name is Nicole and I like to do fashion DIYs and yeah, happy self-isolation. If you are like me and also stuck inside with not much to do, then it is the perfect time to maybe start sewing, which is what I'm finally going to do. It is literally like day 6 of self-isolation and I swear I am made for this life. I've cleaned and I've organized things, but all the work that I told myself I was gonna get done, I haven't started yet. But I figured I have nothing but time on my hands, so what's the rush? Anyways, in today's video, I managed to run out to Value Village last week before everything got crazy, and I picked up a couple things that I am going to rework. And today's inspiration is from Aritzia's newer spring collection. There were a couple things that I saw when I was in there maybe, I don't know, 2 weeks ago now that really caught my eye, and I wanted to try to recreate them, and clearly now is just the best time to do so. And because I have nothing else to do, hopefully the editing process of this video will be quick and efficient and it'll actually be uploaded within a timely manner because editing is forever the death of me. Anyways, yeah, so if you want to see how these tutorials turned out, then keep watching.
Okay, so as I mentioned, the inspiration for this video came from Aritzia. This is the Countess blouse by Sunday Best, and I am typically drawn to things that are a little bit more feminine, form-fitting, and cropped. And this blouse hit all 3 of those things, except I planned on making mine in black, and to do that, I will be using this black button-down men's shirt. So my design will be a little bit different since it will have buttons down the front. Okay, so first off, please excuse the nails during this tutorial. I needed to give them a break, but to start, I'm going to be removing the pocket with the seam ripper. If you can find a dress shirt without a pocket, that would be ideal, but seam ripping them off also does the trick. Once the pocket has been removed, I am going to map out my neckline. To do that, I am going to take this top that I have, that also happens to be Sunday Best, and use it as a guide to roughly mark out my neckline with chalk. But I am only going to be drawing out half of the neckline before cutting, because once I reach the middle, I am going to fold the top in half and trace the new neckline out with chalk to ensure both sides were even before cutting the other side out. Now I have my new neckline. Then I trimmed off the sleeves. With side seams together, I folded the top in half, so I can remove some of the excess fabric from the back. I measured out 4 inches on the fold, so in total I was removing 8 inches of fabric from the back of the top. Be sure to save this panel of fabric, we will be using it later. The next step was to add the gathers in the bodice. I measured about 6 inches down from the center of the neckline, and I wanted it to curve upwards at the side to give the body more shape. Once I am happy with the shape, I'm going to cut along that line. When you are cutting, you want to be careful not to cut through the side seam or the placket. Once both slits have been cut, I am going to sew 2 gathering stitches along the bust of the blouse. To sew a gathering stitch, you want to make sure your stitch length is set to the widest stitch length before sewing. Then you are going to pull gently from both sides until you get the desired gathered effect, and repeat the same on the other side. To take in the front, I'm going to create princess seams on either side of the bodice. To do this, I need to break this into quarters. So I'll start with the center. I am using the buttons as a reference. From there, I am measuring out the center on either side, essentially to create my princess seams. Then cut along that line. To know how much excess fabric I will need to remove, I will need to figure out what the final width would be. So I measured the distance just below my bust, which measures at 15 inches for me. So I am mentally going to remove 1 inch from my equation since that is the width of the placket and I will not be removing that. So that would be 14 inches in total, and I would have to divide that by 2 because I'm dividing between 2 sides. So both sides of the front bodice will need to be 7 inches after removing the excess. So that's how I figured out how much I needed to remove, and I only removed it from the side, not the middle. Once I measured out how much I needed to remove, I added my seam allowance and cut. I pinned right sides together before sewing and repeated the same process on the other side. An easy way to make sure both sides are even is to use the scraps you cut off as a guide to ensure you're taking off the same amount. I just pinned the pieces in place and then cut. Once both seams are sewn, this is what we are working with. Next, it's time to sew up the bust line. The nice thing about using a gathering stitch for something like this is that you can easily adjust the fabric so the fabric can lay evenly, and then sew to both sides. And it's slowly coming together. I am now just going to remove the visible gathering stitches with a seam ripper. Moving on to the neckline of the top, I'm going to add elastic. I took some 1/2 inch elastic and measured the circumference across my shoulders to figure out how much I would need. I realized afterwards that I should have used a little less to make it a little more secure, so keep that in mind when measuring. To pin the elastic to the top, it's easiest when you work in halves. Start by finding the middle of your elastic and top by folding it in half and marking with chalk. Then pin the 2 points together. Then I proceeded to pin down each side and eyeballed the middle of the elastic and the shirt and pinned again. And keep breaking it down into smaller sections to try to evenly distribute the elastic. Once it was pinned in place, I used a zigzag stitch to secure it in place, making sure to pull the elastic tight when sewing. For a cleaner finish and to hide the visible elastic, I just turned down the elastic edge once and sewed a top stitch to keep it in place. Once it's finished, it looks something like this. Now I am going to repeat the same process to the ends of my sleeves. I cut the 2 pieces of the elastic that fit snug and comfortably around my arm, and then cut a little bit of extra space as a seam allowance and sewed them together. As you can see, it wasn't pretty, but it doesn't matter because you won't see that anyways. Then I marked both of the elastics into quarters with chalk and did the same thing to my sleeves and pinned to match each quarter mark together. And sewed with a zigzag stitch, and once it was sewn, I flipped down the elastic hem and sewed a single top stitch. Okay, so this is what we're working with at the moment. The next thing I will need to tackle is the hemline. So I had originally marked that I wanted the hem just above the button, but I decided to bring it just below by about 1/2 inch. Then I added an extra 1/2 inch as my hem allowance. And then I trimmed off the extra. I then used my serger to clean up the raw edge before doing a single folded hem. I would recommend using a zigzag stitch if you don't have a serger, or doing a double folded hem to avoid seeing a raw edge. Once the hem is complete, we are now moving on to the back panel that we had put aside earlier. I will be shearing this piece. Shearing is when you use elastic thread in the bobbin of your machine to give it that ruched elastic effect you find on many clothing items. To start, I need to cut the panel to size. To be honest, I should have just left this piece since it will shrink in size once the elastic has been sewn. But anyways, I trimmed it down to be about 6 inches in width and made it only about 1 inch longer in length than the top itself to accommodate a 1/2 inch hem on both the top and bottom. Now it's time to shear. To do that, you will need some elastic thread and an empty bobbin. You have to hand wind the bobbin yourself, but it's very easy. Just wrap the elastic thread around the bobbin with a fair bit of tension until the bobbin is full. You can then just put the bobbin in your machine as if you normally would. Now I'm going to start stitching straight lines horizontally until I go the full length of the top. You will need to rewind your bobbin a few times, so pay attention so it doesn't run out. I also wanted to add some shearing to the sleeves above the elastic since that's what the original top had, so I did 3 rows on either sleeve. Once I completed the shearing to the back panel, it was time to attach that to the shirt. I removed about 2.5 inches from either side of the back. This includes my seam allowance, then pinned the shearing panel to either side with right sides together before sewing. And this DIY is done. I love the way this turned out. The only thing I wish I did differently was make the shearing panel in the back a little bit larger, but now that I see it on, it's really not so bad. For my second transformation, I am going to try to recreate the Savita tank by Wilfred Free. I was drawn to this tank, 1, because of the color, and 2, the side ruching. I've been wanting to do a project that has that effect for ages now, so this top was the one. This is the top I'm going to be transforming. I know I could have made it easier on myself by finding a tank top, but I like the challenge, so a short sleeve it is. But whatever you find, make sure it is a knit and it has some stretch. I'm going to start by making myself a pattern, but don't worry, this one is pretty easy. To do this, I drew out a rectangle with the width of 15 inches. I got this measurement from measuring across my body, basically side seam to side seam. I technically measure at 16 inches, but because the fabric has some stretch to it, I removed 2 inches but added a 1/2 inch seam allowance to both sides to make it 15 inches in total. If you are bustier, I would recommend tapering the pattern so it's larger at the bust area. And the height of the rectangle is roughly the length you desire, but add an inch or so for hem allowances. I believe my rectangle measured at 15 by 9 inches. Then I am going to mark out 1.5 inches from each top corner, then use my S-curve ruler to create sort of a quarter circle before cutting the pattern. This pattern piece is going to be our back and front, so I can pin it directly to my shirt and cut it out once, going through both layers of fabric. Once the pieces were cut out, I flipped it so right sides were facing each other and pinned both sides together before sewing. Once it was sewn, I slipped on the top to see how the fit was and realized I wanted to remove another 1/2 inch from the top. Once I had trimmed that, I folded the top in half to remove the same amount on the other side. Next up, I'm going to do the hem. I use my serger to finish the bottom before doing a single folded hem. When working with knits, it's important to swap out your needle for a ballpoint needle. This will allow your machine to sew through the knit fabric without getting caught or stuck in the machine. Moving on to the side ruching, I am taking some of my remaining fabric and cut out 2 strips that are roughly 2 by 6 inches. Then I am going to pin each strip to the inside of the top right along my side seam, and I'm going to sew 3 straight stitches to create 2 channels. I found it easiest to make all 3 stitches straight if I started in the middle and then moved to the outside. Now I'm going to make the draw cord that will go into these channels. I took the remaining fabric I had to create 2 strips that were 1 inch in length. Luckily, my shirt was long enough to make the draw cord, otherwise you would have to sew strips together to get the desired length. And then I just folded it with right sides together and sewed, and I used my loop turner to flip them right side out. Before I insert the draw cord, I am going to finish the straps and neckline. Starting with the neckline, I am going to be using this double folded bias tape that I just happen to have in the exact same color. If you don't have bias tape, you can just do a simple hem and create the straps the same way you made the draw cord, but since I have it, I'm going to use it. To use the bias tape, you just open up the folds and pin with right sides together. Once it's all pinned in place, I'm going to sew right in that first crease. Then you are going to flip the bias tape over to the back side at the top, making sure to sandwich all the fabric in between before pinning, and sewing a top stitch to keep everything in place. Once it is sewn, I repeated the same to the back and pressed with an iron. To do the straps, I measured on myself the desired amount I would need and then cut 2 identical strips. Making sure to start at the armpit, I pinned the bias tape open to the top and then stitched along the crease. Then flipped the bias tape to the back to sew a top stitch around the whole strap, keeping everything in place. Then I repeated this process to the other side. Now that the straps are done, the last thing we need to do is insert the draw cord. To do that, I am going to pin a safety pin to one end and then feed it through both channels and finish both loose ends with a simple knot. And this top is complete. I'm really happy with the way this turned out, and I also love how you can wear it in different ways depending if you want to pull the sides or tie it in a bow or leave the strings just hanging. There are so many options. And yeah, that is it for this week's video. Please let me know which DIY you liked best in the comments below, and thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this tutorial, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you'd like to see more DIY fashion content. And I will catch you in the next one. Bye!